In fact, this will be very difficult. We have to deploy technologies at a rate that is unprecedented. For instance, just look at the last bullet. Nuclear must increase such that we're building something like 20 new nuclear plants per year, for example. We only build 2 new ones today. That's one of the potential options for lowering CO2. In Shell, we've used scenarios to help us look at the future and think about the different pathways that we might follow. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time today in explaining the 2 scenarios that we've recently published that give very different pictures about the future that we might face. And the scenarios really look at some of the trends that we see today and amplify them into the future. They look at the trend, for instance, of nationalism. What happens if we go to a very national-based, nationalistic approach in the world, where we think of our country first and not think of the bigger world? Or what happens if we go to a much more cooperative approach and start to put together structures around the world that might lead to a progressive change? And so the 2 scenarios are called Scramble and Blueprint. And in the Scramble world, we look very much at the nationalistic trends that we see in parts of the world today. And in the Blueprints world, we look very much at the cooperative approaches that we see in the world today. And we imagine that one of those will take root and really grow. And we see very different outcomes as a result of that. In a nationalistic approach, our focus is entirely on really meeting energy demand. So we focus on national mechanisms to generate more energy. It means that there's more coal used because that's abundant throughout the world. We focus very much on supply security for our own countries. In the Blueprints world, we take a very different approach. We start to build institutions globally, many times from the bottom up, which lead to things like global carbon markets, which start to put a carbon price around the world and start to cause our economies to react differently to the energy sources that we have. And not surprisingly, the outcome from these 2 is very different. Shell has taken the approach of unusually, because we never normally comment on our scenarios, we put the scenarios out as 2 possible futures. And whilst we recognise that both of these futures are possible, it's the Blueprint scenario that we think the world needs to try and follow. That doesn't mean it will happen, because we may still continue to fall into the Scramble scenario. The outcome in terms of CO2 is very, very different. In the Scramble scenario, we see that by 2100, emissions just from CO2, because there are other gases as well, have already passed 700 parts per million and are continuing to rise rapidly. In Blueprints, which really is a fundamental change for the world, and a very difficult one, but possible, because we've done all of the calculations to back up to make sure this is a feasible outcome, we see emissions plateauing by the end of this century at around about 550 parts per million. Now, there's still an issue with this, because we know from the science that prevails today that this is still not good enough. And so it poses the additional challenge for us as how do we even do better than the Shell Blueprint scenario. Just to give you some feeling for what are the impacts of the different scenarios, through to 2050 we largely see the same outcomes in terms of the actual climate change, because much of what is going to happen in the next 30 years is already locked in. But in the second half of the century we start to see some real diversion between the 2 scenarios in terms of the impact on our environment. So the benefit of making changes today is not something for hundreds of years in the future. It's really something that we can start to appreciate in just 30 or 40 years. The reality is that these 3 hard truths about accelerating demand, energy struggling to keep up, and the flight to things like coal are very hard.